The deadliest fighters in history were never built on meat. Their own bones hide a secret that sounds impossible. Close your eyes for a moment and picture a gladiator, and you already see the answer nearly everyone gets wrong. You see oiled skin, a deeply carved chest, a stomach like stacked stone, a body forged for the work of killing. That image came from a single film released in the year 2000, starring a famous actor from New Zealand. His character marches into the roaring arena, lean and rippling with muscle, jaw set, every fiber clearly defined. With that one performance shaped how many millions of people across the world still imagine a Roman fighter, even today. The Romans never filmed a single thing. Everything you believe you saw was invented for you many centuries later. And the lie is far older than the movie itself, carved into cold marble before any camera had ever even existed. Classical sculptors handed us gods with flat bellies and broad chests, presenting the ideal male form in stone. What did these men actually look like in real life? And what exactly did they put into their mouths day after day? And remember, the arena was mass entertainment, with many thousands of screaming spectators packed into the stands. A roaring crowd that size clearly wanted spectacle, and we simply assumed spectacle meant a perfect warrior body. So the image locked into place. These elite killers surely must have trained and eaten like elite athletes today. Meat for raw muscle, protein for explosive power, a carnivore's plate to fuel a body that was bred for combat. Your bones are not just dead scaffolding inside you, they slowly rebuild themselves out of the very food you eat. Because back in 1983, a chance discovery in modern Turkey began tearing that whole image apart. Archaeologists were carefully digging in the ground near the crumbling ruins of an old city once called Ephesus. In Roman times, this bustling place was the capital of the entire province of Asia, a wealthy imperial powerhouse. More than 200,000 people once lived there, packed into busy streets, crowded markets, and an arena. Each bone fragment was carefully cleaned, ground down, and processed, so the chemistry could speak for itself now. It was a cemetery, but not an ordinary one at all. Almost every body buried in this ground had died violently. The bones themselves dated to the 2nd and 3rd centuries after Christ, landing at the height of the games. This was a graveyard reserved for one very specific profession, the trained fighters of the arena, and no others. Dozens of gladiators lay buried in that ground, their cracked skeletons still telling the story of how they died. So the very men who thrilled those huge crowds were quietly being labeled after the cheapest cereal in all of Rome. And among all of those fighters lay a single woman, thought to be connected to one of the men buried beside her. For the very first time, scientists could hold the actual bodies, not statues, not paintings, and not a script. These were the real flesh and blood men who walked out onto that sand and fought for their lives before the crowds. And here is exactly where the most obvious question finally gets a real chance to be answered with hard evidence, which then forces a far more uncomfortable question about each and every person who studied old Rome in between. For many centuries, nobody could ever truly know, because food rots away and disappears within days of being eaten. A single meal eaten 1,800 years ago really should be gone forever, leaving behind no trace of itself. Except that a meal actually does leave a faint trace, locked somewhere most people would never even think to look. The secret hidden record of every single meal these men ever ate was waiting quietly inside their own skeletons. Something hidden inside the gladiator routine was clearly pumping extra calcium into them that other people lacked. Every plant and every animal carries its own chemical fingerprint, and that fingerprint ends up in your bones. So a dedicated team from the Medical University of Vienna decided to read those chemical fingerprints directly. They joined forces with a partner university over in Switzerland to run one of the most careful tests ever tried. Their main tool was something called stable isotope analysis, and it works almost like reading a chemical diary. It honestly sounded completely absurd, much like a folktale, the kind of odd details serious historians quietly ignored. They also carefully measured nitrogen, a marker which rises in your bones the more animal protein you consume. A heavy meat eater shows very high nitrogen levels. A true plant eater shows nitrogen that stays noticeably low. They added in sulfur readings as well, which can reveal where a person once lived or whether they had migrated. Then they studied the raw minerals locked deep inside the bone itself, paying close attention to strontium too. But all of this then raises the strangest question of all about the actual bodies that these meals were building. In total, the team carefully examined 53 separate individuals pulled from that violent ground at Ephesus. 22 of those were confirmed as real gladiators, the single largest sample of fighters ever read this way. This was certainly not a guess or some old legend. It was hard laboratory data, published for the entire world. Their findings appeared in a respected scientific journal, left wide open for any scientist on Earth to challenge. A famous physician who personally treated these fighters in the city of Pergamum sharply attacked their bean diet. The machines did not care at all about old movies or marble statues. They only reported what was really there. And when the final numbers came back from the lab, they pointed in a direction nobody in that room had expected. The diet written deep inside these fighters flatly contradicted almost everything popular culture had taught us. The nitrogen readings came back low, strikingly low, the unmistakable signature of a body running fully on plants. The strontium levels measured in the gladiator bones were not low at all. In fact, they were extraordinarily high. The chemistry plainly showed a diet that was overwhelmingly vegetarian, almost entirely free of any animal flesh. Barley and wheat together formed the broad base of it, the very same plants that fed poor farmers everywhere. Their bodies were fueled by thick porridge and by legumes, not by the protein any modern coach would prescribe. That low nitrogen pointed straight at one habit. These fighters were eating an absolutely enormous amount of beans. If you just learned something that Rome knew and we somehow forgot, then subscribe now so the next discovery finds you. Almost no fish at all, almost no dairy at all, and almost no meat of any kind showed up in their deep bone chemistry. The famous killing machines of Rome were quietly eating, just like the humble laborers crowded around them in the city. In fact, their daily diet barely differed in any real way from the ordinary townspeople buried a few streets away. The elite arena fighters and the common laboring poor clearly shared very nearly the same plate of grain and beans. The deadliest fighters in history were never built on meat. Their own bones hide a secret that sounds impossible. There was no secret athlete's diet at all, no lavish carnivore's feast, and no special muscle-building meat ration. It was just barley, just beans, just the cheap and deeply filling everyday food of the ordinary Roman working class. The science behind it was clear, fully repeatable, and almost impossible to argue against once you had seen the data. And yet this discovery should not have shocked anyone at all, because the answer had already been written down long ago. The Romans themselves had recorded exactly what their gladiators ate, in plain words, almost 2,000 years ago. The clue had been sitting there inside ancient texts the entire time, ignored, dismissed, treated as exaggeration. They had even handed these fighters a specific nickname, one that quietly revealed their whole diet in a single word. That nickname openly mocked them, plainly insulted them, and also accidentally preserved the real truth for us today. A Roman writer famous for cataloging the whole natural world recorded the exact name that people used for fighters. He called them the hordearii, an old Latin word that translates very directly and plainly into the simple barley men. The deadliest warriors in the entire empire were nicknamed after a humble field grain. They were the barley eaters. It was certainly not meant as a compliment. Barley was widely considered a lesser food, the grain you fed animals. Some old sources even suggest the fighters were deliberately handed barley of a poor, inferior quality on purpose. So the very men who thrilled those huge crowds were quietly being labeled after the cheapest cereal in all of Rome. A Roman writer famous for cataloging the whole natural world recorded the exact name that people used for fighters. That careful feeding plan centered on two main ingredients above all the rest: plain barley and the humble fava bean. The fava bean, known to the Romans in Latin as vicia faba, served as the real protein backbone of every fighter's day. Their signature daily dish was a thick, heavy porridge called pools, which was also the everyday fuel of the Roman poor. An old Roman statesman once recorded the recipe: barley and fava beans simply boiled together for a long while. Into that simmering pot went chopped onion, a splash of vinegar, and garlic, simple flavors for a very simple meal. This gray and heavy porridge was the exact thing that powered the bodies that bled out on the sand for entertainment. So the written texts and the buried bones now agreed together perfectly. These fighters truly were barley bean eaters. The ancient written record and the modern chemistry both told the exact same story, reaching across many centuries. An old Roman statesman once recorded the recipe: barley and fava beans simply boiled together for a long while. If the Romans plainly told us in writing, why did it take until our own century for anyone to finally believe them? The answer is that scholars had simply assumed the old nickname was a joke, and never a literal description of diet. Their stomachs and their chests were very likely softened by a thick, trembling layer of fat sitting under the skin. A human body living only on barley and beans, with no dairy and almost no meat, will quickly start to lack calcium. Calcium is the mineral that keeps your bones dense and hard, and this poor diet simply did not provide enough of it. Fighters constantly taking heavy blows from swords and tridents needed strong, dense bones more than almost anyone alive. By every known rule of basic nutrition, these men really should have had weak, brittle, easily shattered skeletons. So the scientists fully braced themselves to find exactly that: a set of fragile bones badly starved of their minerals. Instead, the readings revealed something strange that made no real sense for a diet so genuinely poor in calcium. Calcium is the mineral that keeps your bones dense and hard, and this poor diet simply did not provide enough of it. Strontium is a mineral that quietly rides along with calcium, and then gets stored away deep inside your bone tissue. High strontium clearly means a body that had somehow been flooded with rich minerals from an unusually rich source. The fighters consistently showed roughly double the strontium found in the bones of ordinary Ephesian citizens. Double the stored minerals, in men who supposedly only ever ate the very same cheap grain as their poor near neighbors. Something hidden inside the gladiator routine was clearly pumping extra calcium into them that other people lacked. It was not coming from milk, not from cheese, and not from meat, because the bone chemistry had ruled all those out. These particular fighters had somehow found a rich mineral source that their fellow citizens were apparently not using. The plant diet had carried a fatal flaw within it, and somehow these men had quietly engineered a way around it. The question now was simple yet deeply strange. Where on earth was all of that extra calcium actually coming from? The true answer was so genuinely odd that for a very long time scholars had refused to take the texts seriously. Roman writers had clearly described the gladiators drinking a strange tonic, and historians had assumed it was myth. The old texts said that the fighters drank a strange beverage made entirely from ashes after their training sessions. Plant ashes, carefully burned down to a fine powder and then stirred into liquid, were swallowed like a recovery drink. It honestly sounded completely absurd, much like a folk tale, the kind of odd detail serious historians quietly ignored. But ash made from burned plants and bone is genuinely loaded with one thing above the rest: pure mineral calcium. The lead scientist on the whole study carefully explained the exact reason why these men drank something so strange. He said the plant ashes had clearly been consumed in order to strengthen the body in the wake of hard physical effort. The ashes also helped their battered bones to heal far faster, knitting fresh fractures together between the fights. That bizarre and gritty beverage was, when put into plain modern terms, an ancient calcium and mineral supplement. Eaten whole centuries before any pills or powders existed, these clever fighters had already built their bone tonic. And the high strontium locked away inside their skeletons was the hard physical proof that they had really drunk it. The chemistry confirmed the ancient texts almost word for word. That strange ash drink was no mere legend. It was real. The Romans had written it all down. Later scholars had laughed it off. And now the buried bones had proven them right. A single fighter's day now comes sharply into focus. Thick barley porridge, boiled fava beans, and a cup of ashes. Plant fuel for raw energy, humble beans for protein, and burned ash purely to keep the working skeleton from breaking. It was a complete nutritional system, quietly designed by a people who had never once heard the word nutrition. But all of this then raises the strangest question of all about the actual bodies that these meals were building. If there was truly no meat and no muscle diet, what kind of physique did all this heavy plain barley actually create? The fighters were absolutely not lean and chiseled. That carbohydrate-heavy diet was steadily packing on body fat. And right here, the strange mystery only deepens, because this plain plant diet should have destroyed these men's bones. That bizarre and gritty beverage was, when put into plain modern terms, an ancient calcium and mineral supplement. One of the lead researchers argued that the fat layer worked as a kind of natural body armor for each of the men. And astonishingly enough, that softness was never an accident at all. It was in fact the entire deliberate point of it. A sharp blade that sliced its way into that fat layer would open a dramatic wound without ever cutting anything vital. Shallow surface cuts looked utterly spectacular and terrifying while still leaving the deep muscle and the organs alone. Shallow surface cuts looked utterly spectacular and terrifying while still leaving the deep muscle and the organs alone. The fat layer made the whole show far bloodier and the fighter far more durable. A genuinely perfect arena combination. Então, a forma suave que os olhos modernos imediatamente zombariam era, na verdade, uma adaptação de sobrevivência inteligente e totalmente deliberada. And one ancient doctor saw this very softness up close for himself, and then openly complained about it in his writings. A famous physician who personally treated these fighters in the city of Pergamum sharply attacked their bean diet. He wrote that all of those endless fava beans had made the men's flesh turn soft, loose, and somehow rather flabby. He said it was certainly not the dense and compact flesh of good pork, but instead something far looser and much weaker. A famous physician who personally treated these fighters in the city of Pergamum sharply attacked their bean diet. Even their very own doctor thought the bodies plainly looked wrong, yet that exact wrongness was what kept them alive. They were carefully fed barley, beans, and ashes to grow a thick, fat layer that armored them against the enemy blades. The plant diet built real durability and bloody spectacle, never the lean, hard muscle that all of our movies pretend at. And it took all the way until a careful study in 2014 for Science to confirm what Rome had written down. The ancient writers had been completely right for 2,000 long years, and we had simply refused to believe them. The plant diet built real durability and bloody spectacle, never the lean, hard muscle that all of our movies pretend at. The deadliest fighters on all of Earth ran purely on beans, on ash, and on fat, and now you know why their bones agree.